I don't want to see unnecessary anxiety out there in the Australian community as ordinary Australians watch the bad news unfold on their television screens from overseas each night.
The Prime Minister earlier guaranteeing bank deposits of Australians. We're now joined by the Opposition Leader, Malcolm Turnbull. Mr Turnbull, has the government gone far enough to shore up Australia's financial system?
Oh, the government steps today are very welcome. We will give them very strong support in the Parliament.
OK, so you can absolutely guarantee you'll back the government, full bipartisan support to this rescue package, all of it?
Yeah, absolutely. The deposit guarantee and the further investment in the mortgage market were actually recommended. Expansion of the guarantee and further investment in the mortgage market were recommended by us. So we're delighted the government is doing this, and as I've said, we will support the government in getting any necessary legislation through the Parliament.
Any more they can do? Anything else they should be looking at?
Well, they should be looking at everything. That's why, Koshi, we're so keen to sit down and talk about this with them in a constructive, bipartisan way. I wrote my only disappointment today.
All workers dread.
When someone comes and tells you, no, sorry mate, you haven't got a job, it is a big shock.
He's retrained and now runs his own small business.
I can't see the car industry really surviving the way that it is now.
Unemployment was at a record low when Mitsubishi crashed. The budget predicted it would stay below 5%. That's now out the window.
Likely to be higher than has been projected. We don't have numbers on that.
Respected economist Bob Gregory does.
I'll be taking good odds on 6, 7 at least by the end of next year.
A jump to 7% unemployment would put between another 300,000 and 500,000 people out of work. The industries where jobs are most at risk are building, manufacturing, mining and retail.
Businesses will not want to have to reduce their employment levels. Ultimately, employment is a product of the level of business activity.
The boom in mineral sales to China has acted like a security blanket to Australia. But now, even China's feeling the pinch.
China is nowhere near the short-run security blanket that we might have thought of 6 months ago.
What we're seeing is some pushback from the Chinese on some of the raw materials exports to that country.
Mr Lawcock doesn't agree with predictions the mineral boom is over.
I think this is a bump in the road.
I think businesses are steeling themselves for some tougher economic times, and as a nation we need to steel ourselves for some tougher economic times.
And tougher times for some families.
There was one guy who worked for me, he just got married, just bought a house, found out his wife was pregnant and finds out he's losing his job. So that was a big, for him, he was devastated.
Whatever the circumstances are, it will be important for Australians to think flexibly about their employment opportunities to make sure their skills are maintained.
Flexibility, like going from making cars to making sandwiches.
Mark Riley there. And Mark tells us Prime Minister Rudd had a 30-minute crisis call with Chinese President Wen Jiabao last week. Now, the PM wanted to know whether China will keep buying Australian resources. He got a mixed response. China expects a slowdown, but it'll still be growing at 9%. Let's go back to Richard Quest in London at CNN. Richard, will China save the day for Australia? It is being seen as our big security blanket.
It may not be a big, comfortable feather duvet that it was a few years ago of a security blanket. It may be a bit threadbare, but it's certainly going to be a very comfortable place for you to fall upon. It's your get-out-of-jail-free card, if you like, Koshi, in this crisis, because 9% economic growth by China to support its own domestic demand. China may not be exporting as much to the United States and to the European Union, but its domestic demand is still strong. They're still going to be growing, and yes, from that point of view, I do agree. China is very comfortably the bit about which you're going to fall back upon.
Okay, all right, Richard, stay with us. Now, I want to bring in Andrew Banks now to talk about jobs. Andrew founded recruitment giant Morgan & Banks and Talent too. More importantly, he's been through lots of economic downturns. Andrew, we've just heard that maybe unemployment going to 7 or 8%. What are the most vulnerable jobs?
Well, I guess jobs that aren't skilled and or semi-skilled. But I think the good news about Australia is generally when we lose work, it's across a broad range. So we don't have sort of industries that are, have a large percentage of our workforce that it's concentrated on. So it tends to be fairly evenly spread.
Okay.
Interestingly, only about 65% of Australians have a permanent job. So we have a lot of permanent, part-time, flexible work. And I agree with some of the earlier commentators that I think this will help us. But the thing that makes me a bit more optimistic than some of the others is that this is unlike the 90s when we had the dark days of double-digit unemployment. We have all the world's engines of growth. We didn't have the Eastern European countries, India and China, working in the 90s. That's pretty new.
Okay.
We've got record lows of unemployment. But also, interestingly, Koshi, because we've been short of people for the last 4 or 5 years, capacity constraints, as we would say, but in plain English, we haven't had enough people. So companies have been quite lean.
Okay.
And so it's not like we've got fat, dumb and happy companies that have had too many people.
What if you're in the local branch of a big international company that's doing it tough overseas and is saying, right, we're going to cut staff across the board, or you work for a small to medium-sized business where the boss is doing it tough now, it's going to get even tougher. Should you start reskilling? Should you start looking around?
Well, I think the important thing is don't jump to conclusions, as the Prime Minister says, just because there's some bad news coming in on a wire from overseas. The problem with the world today is there's about 1.8 billion of us in a chat room and we all talk ourselves into things. So if you're concerned about your job or your company, go and have a chat to someone, your boss or people, and say, how's it going? I think the message to CEOs of companies is communicate, talk about what's going on. But generally speaking, I don't think people should overreact. Because otherwise they could create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sure. All right, Andrew, thanks for your time. Next on Minding Your Money, the outlook for your most important asset, your home.